Let's see here. Okay, all right. Um, yes, okay, so we are now live on YouTube. Excuse me. So welcome everybody. I'm going to go ahead and mute everyone. And as always, if you have a question, you can either hit the chat feature, which will tend to bring something up on the right side of your screen that allows you to raise your hand, or you can, when I pause from time to time, you can certainly unmute yourself and we'll work that out. So this is live on YouTube. I have a question here from someone who wasn't able to be here last week. Yes, we are recording these on YouTube. So if you go to the Colonial Church YouTube web page, you'll find our session, which for last week would be session 3. So this week is session 4. So, all right. So I just want to welcome everybody. Let me say a quick word of prayer, and then we'll jump in. Okay. So let's pray together. Lord, we thank you for this day. We thank you for the beautiful reminder that you are indeed Lord, even in the midst of the cacophony that we heard about today in the sermon. We ask and pray that you still our souls and our minds, that we might learn and think and reflect together on those who've gone beyond and gone past us or lived before us, that we might learn lessons for now as we think about our future. We thank you for this time in your name. Amen. Okay, well, I'm sure we're going to have folks kind of filtering in, which is the case. So if you see me look semi-distracted every now and then, it's because I'll be letting people in. So the first thing I'd like to do is to share my screen with all of you. And perfect. All right, great. So we are in our class together. I'm going to go back here if I can. I think it would work if I turn that on. All right, so this is session 4, week 4 together of our class, Rebels, Radicals, and Ranters, the unexpected history of Congregationalism. We've talked a couple of times at the beginning of each of our session, actually, why it is that we're having this class. Our church is currently kind of undergoing thinking about our history, thinking about our future, with the possibility of changing our name. There's all kinds of things up in the air. And there's also just the salutary need from time to time to go back and think about the roots, hear about the stories that have shaped your tradition, the good ones and the bad ones. And certainly we get both of those in our tradition. So that's why we are doing this class right now. Over the course of the last couple of weeks, we have engaged much of the early history. We're finally kind of, I'm happy to say, up into New England. Our first week, we really spent our time talking basically about the English Reformation, which effectively is sort of the backdrop for the rise of Congregationalism. So Congregationalism in many ways arises in England in the English context, and in some ways as a response to what comes to be called the Elizabethan settlement, which is the way of they're going to do church in England, which we've come to kind of call now either Anglican or Episcopalian. They have their roots in that tradition. We then talked about the group out of which Congregationalism in a sense comes, which is this big tent group called the Puritans. This includes people who are committed to a Congregationalist vision, others who are committed to a Presbyterian vision, still others who want to see more egalitarianism in the society, others who have all kinds of interesting critiques. In fact, there's even an argument that some of the early Quakers start among the Puritans. So a pretty broad array of folks. And then last week, we began to talk through, so we sort of mapped out what that movement looked like. And then the week after, we got a chance to introduce be introduced to some of the key figures, Thomas Cartwright, Robert Brown, and Henry Barrow. They became central for our own story, particularly Robert Brown and Henry Barrow. Last week, then, so that's catching us up into the week 3. We noted that towards the end of Elizabeth's reign, so we're talking here about the 1590s into the early 1600s, the crown, with the help of the archbishop, manages to effectively suppress the Puritan factions. And when this happens, it unleashes a new set of dynamics in terms of what Puritanism is going to look like. And I think one of the most important elements of that is, and this was of course present beforehand, but I think comes more and more to the surface because much of the story that we've told so far up to that point was the story of the separatist Puritans, or the separatist Congregationalists. That is, people who felt that they needed to leave the Church of England in order to pursue their vision of church. There is an entire other group, though, which actually dwarfs in terms of size and eventually influence, which are called the non-separatists. Some of those non-separatists decide that they are going to try to work within the system during this period, and I guess all of them are trying to decide that on some level, but some are more willing to do that than others. And they might be described as non-separatist conformists. That is, people who find a local bishop who maybe knows that they have Puritan sympathies, but they see that they're an effective minister, and that's what they want. They want effective ministers for their parishes. So they're willing to work with them. They're willing to allow them to not do certain things that they might be required to do to conform, while in other things they may be required to do the things that they don't want to do. There's then another sort of subgroup that would be included here in the non-separatist category, and this is the non-conformists. These are the folks who have similar Puritan sympathies as the conformists, but they just can't bring themselves, or they can't find a situation that would allow them to kind of work the system in a sense. So they're constantly sort of trying to evade arrest or being discovered during this period, and many of them are going to begin to flee into exile. And as we told the story, that the first sort of migration in a way goes over to Holland, right, to Amsterdam and Leiden and places like that. We then also noted the ongoing pressure and pressures on the separatists, the ones whose story we had been telling prior to this. These are folks who had decided, because of this early Puritan Congregationalist view of giving power to the church, or to the congregation, I should say, as opposed to a hierarchical superstructure in the persons of bishops, et cetera, that also came along with it the assumption that only people who were truly called, i.e. true believers, should really be members of the church. And so they felt that because of the nature of the English church, in which everyone born in England was presumably a member, that this was not a rigorous enough approach or way to being church. So as I mentioned before, this is the time when having your doors wide open for anyone to come in, that is not the approach that these early Puritans are taking. They want to make it much more difficult. They're going to have much more of a gatekeeping kind of mentality. So the separatists are of such an intensity in that regard that they have to separate themselves. They wind up leaving because they believe that the Anglican Church, the established church, is too filled with error. We then talked about the exiles then that make their way over into Holland, because that is an important part of the sort of story. A couple of the examples were a church, the London Amsterdam church that we discussed. I'm not going to go into all the details of these, just to sort of highlight, remember, and if you want to rewatch more detailed discussion, you can always go back to YouTube to see session 3. I will say on this second one, the Gainsborough Scrooby community, the Scrooby one became especially important because this is eventually the community that settles in Leiden that winds up becoming the Pilgrims, right? We talk about the Pilgrims coming over in 1620. Well, they come originally out of Scrooby, and there's a figure there who's attached to them, a man named John Robinson. So that, I think, is an important episode to have in mind in terms of understanding our history. We also mentioned that during this time, not only are separatists, which is what the London, Amsterdam, and the Gainsborough Scrooby communities are, they're all the separatist versions. They're also non-separatists, right, who have decided that they need to flee because they can no longer abide the situation in England. And we discussed a couple of those figures and their approach, their way of belief. And effectively, I think it'd be fair to say that I used an analogy that we find in Pietism, because I think the Pietists actually take this to a certain extent from the Puritans. And that is this belief that you can have communities within a larger community. So in Pietism, it's about the small group. So the belief was that if you have small groups of people who are truly awakened, then they can become like leaven that will help awaken the larger church, right? And so basically they took this model from the Puritans, who essentially are arguing you can have these, small congregations within a larger superstructure, i.e. the Church of England, that eventually might transform the Church of England. So that's kind of the approach that is described in the work of William Ames, and that's sort of the vision. That's how they navigate being non-separatist Puritans within the context of Anglicanism. Then, lastly, we discussed the migration, right? So I told you that now we're going to kind of shift our lens away from Europe. I did mention, and I'm hoping today to be able to wrap this up, that we would give a glance back to things that happen in England, because that's going to be important for understanding the unfolding of our story. But the migration to New England, right, begins with the separatists who come over from Leiden in 1620. And then the much, much larger migration that begins to happen in 1630. And if you recall the numbers there from 1630 to about 1642, the estimates are that around 20,000 people wind up migrating. Most of those we might identify as Puritan, but over time, as you're going to see, there's going to be lots and lots of people immigrating into Massachusetts and New England, many of whom have no desire to be Puritans, some of who and some of who can't join the church, and that's going to become an issue that we'll talk about as we move forward. All right, so that's from last week. Let me go ahead and move us in. So what I want to do this week really is paint a picture for you of the vision of the first generation of the New England Congregationalists. And I'm going to start using the word Puritan now, in part because in New England, for the most part, everybody who is a Puritan is probably a Congregationalist. And everyone who is a Congregationalist is a Puritan. There are a few Presbyterian Puritans, but they're a definite minority, and they wind up really settling in New York and New Jersey and places like that. So they're not really a part of our story. So we tend to use as a colloquial expression, right, the New England Puritans. And so that's kind of what we're talking about. So this early vision, and they have a very distinct vision. They're going to try to put it into practice. You're going to see, I think, that there are cracks and problems kind of from the beginning that are challenged, particularly from within. And then the story of the second, third, fourth generation is, in some ways, how do we keep this together? And then eventually realizing we're not going to be able to keep it together, so we're going to need to update what we're doing. We're going to need to reevaluate it. And that's going to become a key element of our history, which is the willingness to innovate as things change. Right. So as the historical contextual situation changes, our own approach to things need to change. All right. So first generation vision, I'm going to kind of do this in the opposite direction. I'm going to do sort of the civil component first, and then the church component with the theology last. Oftentimes I will flip this around, but I think this is as good a way in to come on in as any. And I'm talking here particularly about the vision of the nonconformists, and the reason why we're going to do that, or not the non-separatists. The reason that we're going to do that is because they become the dominant power in the Massachusetts area, and eventually, when we get up into the 18th century, the Plymouth colony is actually going to be absorbed into the Boston, Massachusetts Bay Colony. So it's kind of, this is sort of the folks, these are the folks in Boston and Salem and places like that that are kind of creating this vision. And I think we can start with this phrase, a city upon a hill, as a city upon a hill, because this is a very famous phrase that shows up in the sermon of John Winthrop, who is one of the key organizers of the Massachusetts Bay Colony and becomes the first governor of the colony. And he articulates this idea on board ship before they dock and make landfall. And the basic idea, and I think this kind of sets it well because it gives you a sense about what it is they're trying to do. They believe that they want to set up in the context of where they're going an ideal church polity and form of civil governance that can then become a light that will shine back to England. So this is what they mean by describing it as a city set upon a hill, right? Drawing out of that biblical imagery. We're going to be an example for the reform and transformation of the English church and the English government. So church polity and civil governance, these two things are tightly bound together in the vision of this first generation. And that's going to be one of the things that's going to prove somewhat problematic and is going to, over time, become unraveled, because in some ways it has to become unraveled. So if we talk about the civil component, I think we can say that we have a mixture of aristocratic and democratic impulses. So what I mean by the aristocratic component is that there is a clear hierarchy. There's a clear sense that some people are going to be in charge and others are not, but that more people than normal, this is the democratic part, are going to have a say in who gets put in charge. And so let me kind of describe some of this. So the key governing body of the colony is what comes to be called the General Court. And the magistrates that preside on that court are, as I say here, are chosen and voted on by freemen or stockholders of the company. So these would be people who have some sort of investment, which means then that they're probably, wealthy enough to have invested. Eventually, the ability to vote on magistrates is, and the idea, the category of freemen is going to be extended out. It's going to be broadened to include church members. So you could be a member of so theoretically, you could be a member of the church, but not necessarily have enough money to be a stockholder in the Massachusetts Bay Company. But at the very beginning, and I'd say that this probably transitions. In fact, I think I have in my note, this transitions within about 6 years. So it's pretty early on that happens. However, here's the aristocratic part. So some folks, and not everyone, but some church members or stockholders at the beginning are able, and these are all men. Remember, as I mentioned before, women do not have the right to vote at this point in time and won't have for about 300 years, to the shame, obviously, of this tradition, but that's just the way it is in terms of the history. These men then vote on and choose the governor. So the governor is not chosen by direct election. The governor rather is chosen by the magistrates, who themselves are chosen by a certain confined number of people. All right. So you have aristocratic and democratic impulses. You don't necessarily have a monarchical element because they don't have a king, except of course that they have their king back in England. As I mentioned here, these things are going to change, right? And within about 6 years, only church members are going to be allowed to vote. They also ban ministers in order to sort of emphasize and enforce, at least from one direction, some kind of separation between church and state. So this is another element that's kind of interesting here, is that in some ways, there's a strong element of separation of church and state from one angle. And then from another angle, there's a very strong connection of church and state. And we'll talk about that in just a moment. So no minister is allowed to hold a civil office. And then eventually the governor is going to be chosen by popular vote. So these things are going to take a little bit of time, but they're going to evolve in this direction actually relatively quickly. As I mentioned, one of the most important, maybe troubling things that happens for the vision is the linkage of church membership and enfranchisement. And that's going to come under a lot of strain within the first decade. So people are going to start complaining that only church members should be allowed to vote. And the reason for this is because it's very hard to become a member of the church. And I'll talk a little bit about this as we get a little bit closer. Pardon me. Okay, so we have this element, right? Mixture of aristocratic democratic impulses. We have something like a little bit of separation of church and state. Ministers can't hold civil office. On the flip side, though, we have a very strong sense that the civil authorities do have a role in protecting the church. And the church here is not any church, it is specifically the Congregational Puritan churches. So that needs to be underlined. So civil authorities, and here they pretty much, this tradition is kind of replicating assumptions that were prevailing in Europe and England and pretty much anywhere you went, certainly within a Christian context, which is the idea that there was a symbiotic relationship between the church and the state, that the church in some ways is meant to buttress through preaching, through encouragement of people living good moral lives to be good citizens, and maybe even offering theological justification through things like the divine right of kings or other kinds of arguments like that. They do their part for the state, and the state does its part by protecting the integrity of the church, which means several things. In the context of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, this can mean that the civil authorities are supposed to enforce, to a certain extent, doctrine and practice. And particularly what doctrine and practice here means is you're not allowed, the magistrates cannot enforce what you think about in your own mind in terms of your conscience. You're just not allowed to voice if you have serious questions about what you're hearing in the churches or not. So if you take exception to, say, the doctrine of double predestination, that's fine. Just keep it to yourself. Don't go around spreading your critique of it or whatever. That's going to be an issue that we're going to see soon enough. The practice side, of course, has to do with public morality. Are people living according to a certain set of codes? And I think here you can think of something like the Ten Commandments and certain other mores that probably would have accreted to that through the English context. You can also see there the levying to pay clergy salaries. That lasts for quite a while, actually, and eventually goes away, particularly in the 19th century. Now, this idea of the magistrates having a role in protecting the church is not straightforward, in part because Congregationalism has within it already a sort of suspicion about autocratic authority and too much authority being put in the hands of too few people. And rather, we want to have authority really be rooted in the local congregation. So navigating this question is very, very difficult. And there'll be times, for instance, when like the general court will call for a synod. So like, for instance, there's going to be a debate about who should be baptized. Can people be baptized? Can people's children be baptized who those people are not themselves members of the church, but they want to put their children forward to be baptized? Or maybe they're grandchildren of people who are members of the church, but the second generation, they didn't become members, but now there's these children. Can they be baptized? So in order to settle that, right, churches are kind of arguing about this. And in order to settle this and to have some level of uniformity of doctrine, the magistrate might call for a synod, which is basically a meeting of all the ministers. Well, people are going to be like, well, why do you have authority to call for a synod? I mean, you're the magistrates. What does this mean? And are we going to be required once the synod meets to like assent to whatever decisions they come to? So there's a lot of back and forth over a whole host of things here. So we find that this is not necessarily probably going to be sustainable, but this is the idea, at least at the beginning. The one thing we can say for certain, and this is sort of a line that is held from almost the very beginning through the whole of the story, is that civil authorities are not empowered to compel belief or to compel church membership. And so those elements are important to note, just in terms of the sense of trying to have a distinction. Okay, let me stop there and see what kinds of comments or questions folks may have before I transition and shift towards the more theological side of the vision.
Christian, Tom here.
Yeah, go ahead, Tom.
Um, the kind of the two sides I see happening here are uh, kind of a theocracy where God or the church is trying to tell the city state how to operate, or it could be um, the city state telling the church how to operate. You know, you've got like the element of slavery where they come back and say to the pastors, justify our social being.
Yeah, I mean yeah, I think you're kind of naming what I was trying to describe as a kind of symbiotic relationship between church and state, which holds, pretty much anywhere you go in the Christian world. The belief that somehow, and oftentimes it will be described, if you're in the Catholic context, under the idea of the two swords. There are two sources of authority that God grants. One is civil, and one is ecclesiastical. And then the ecclesiastical source winds up donating its power to the civil source, et cetera. There's all kinds of different machinations of this, but I do think the basic vision here is that there's a very tight relationship, even though you already have the earliest sort of expressions of importance of conscience, importance of independence, importance of not allowing uh, too much authority to be concentrated in too few hands. But we still haven't really left to a certain extent. So, for instance, almost all the magistrates, so the magistrates, right, are the folks who are going to be sitting on the general court. They're going to be the ones who are administering justice and various political decisions, and they might even be the ones who call a synod. Almost all those magistrates are themselves going to be members of the church. They're not going to be ministers, but they are going to probably be members. So you have a really tight bonding, right, of church and state, even though you also have places where there's an attempt to separate it, like an ordained minister cannot hold a civil office, right? That's an attempt to separate it, but we're still very closely linked together, church and state, and it's going to take a little while for that to sort of come undone. And I'll paint some of the picture of why that's the case here shortly. I think Vivian, you've got a hand up.
Yeah, I what I'm really taking note of is the fact that this almost feels like there's taxation without representation, in that if the people were being taxed yet not allowed to be members of the church in order to support the clergy, that's that's rather strange.
Absolutely, this is totally an issue, and actually they start. I think for the first 2 or 3 years, they attempt to have to pay for clergy through kind of free will offering, but they find that that is simply unsustainable, and so they have to do some sort of a tax. And so taxation and enfranchisement are kind of bound together as we move forward in terms of the complaints that start to happen. And they become quite serious already in the 1640s. There are basically arguments from pretty powerful merchants in the city who have no ability, who themselves cannot, gain access to the church. They can't become church members. And yet they feel like their rights as quote unquote Englishmen are being denied. And so there's a lot of interesting stuff that happens around that. But that's a great observation. Looks like I've got a question in the chat here. Yeah, who decides whether a person becomes a church member? It's a great question. And I just want to ask, if you're not muted, to please go ahead and mute yourself. Just for a second here, let me answer this question. Effectively, you have to go before the elders of any given community. So you would go to the local church in your community, and the elders and potentially the deacons, depending on how many elders there are in the church, and in some churches you even have to go before the entire congregation, but you would give an accounting of your experience of having come to faith, to Jesus, how God is continuing to work in your life, and then can you answer certain theological questions in a particular direction. Those tends to be but it's a pretty high bar for how people would be able to talk, and whether or not they're authentic or not, those become significant questions. And then I would say also in that regard, within 20 years, there's already an argument within congregational circles about whether or not you can really determine whether someone really is a true believer or not, because you can't see their heart, right? And so they basically say, okay, are you living a moral life? That winds up becoming the standard pretty quickly. And so that will be something that will hold for a little while. But the earlier one was, had you had a proper conversion? And that was to be judged and adjudicated by church officials in the persons of the elders. Great questions. Was there someone else who wanted to ask a question? Go ahead.
Yeah. My question is, I don't want to fail the test at the end. So I want to make sure that I understand a basic thing here. And that is, how is this going to help me figure out what we should do about our name change?
Well, why don't we wait till we get to the end? I mean, I think us revisiting our history and seeing the warts and all, seeing the good and the bad and the ugly, as well as the pretty amazing, is important. One of the things that I have found remarkable, actually, as I've kind of been studying this tradition, is the willingness of the tradition to constantly reinvent itself and to update itself and to rethink who it is, because the setting has changed, right? So we have some key principles that we keep to: local autonomy of the church, a commitment to the centrality of Scripture, the inviolability of individual conscience. But then other things come along and they seem to be a permanent part of the vision, but we find out that doesn't work because the situation does not allow it to work. And so it's the willingness of the tradition to rethink, to be open. And in a sense, I think this is sort of the John Robinson quote, right? There's more light to shine forth, right? We need to allow for the fact that things may change, that things are not totally set, even if we think they're set in a given generation. So that to me is one of the things I think that is a lesson that can be taken from this. And there might be some other things perhaps that people will see as well. Okay, so let me move us forward. So we've talked about then on the civil side. So let's talk about how this is theologically constructed. And it's principally constructed through the category of covenant. We've already talked about covenant as a significant element of the vision of the congregational sort of family. We heard about that first from Robert Brown and Henry Barrow. They're of course borrowing and thinking about this from kind of Calvinistic and Reformed circles. So those are the traditions in some ways that feed into the early argument. And the basic idea was that a church comes into being not because a bishop says that it comes into being, but it comes into being because God calls forth the people, and in calling them forth in a given locale, makes covenant with them, makes an agreement, and then they make an agreement with one another, right, to live in some sort of holy fashion. So covenant becomes really important category by which this first generation in New England is going to think about their community, not just their church, but also the state as well, as you'll see in just a second. So the way that they think about covenant communities, they think about the entirety of New England society as somehow operating under the umbrella or under the big tent of covenant. And they argue that this, as I say here, constitutes a single covenant community, but they have a differentiation that they work with that helps them to kind of make sense to navigate. And this is somewhat effective. It has some I think it does have some unfortunate effects, but it is somewhat successful, and it can help you kind of see how they were trying to thread the needle of the fact that not everybody living in New England, certainly not in the colonies, set aside the indigenous peoples, were themselves committed to, a Puritan vision of the church. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to navigate this, especially if we are thinking about the whole of ourselves as a city set upon a hill? So what they do is they distinguish between two covenants. And this, in some ways, like this is kind of basic Reformed theology, which also comes in some ways out of Luther, which is the idea that there's a covenant of works and there's a covenant of grace, right? A covenant of works is one which tends to be rooted in Adam, right? God brings Adam into being and tells him certain things that he should do and certain things that he should not do, right? And then that becomes kind of extended under the Torah, right? So the Mosaic covenant, in a way, becomes that. So of course, what happens in that regard? Adam disobeys the covenant of works, and the covenant of works, for the most part, in Protestant theology, at least until we get up into like the 19th, 20th century, is problematic. But it is a way for thinking about that there are certain obligations that we might have to one another and to God or to the divine or to something beyond ourselves. So the covenant of works here then is the Mosaic covenant, and the belief is that this covenant applies to everyone, right? So God has made a covenant with the Puritans. That's their argument, and that covenant includes two components, one of which is the covenant of works, right? And Israel then, the history of Israel, particularly the Old Testament, becomes a very important cipher through which the Puritans will read their experience in the New World, right? They will begin to understand themselves in some sense like Israel, and they will even attempt to think about how they are organizing themselves politically based on certain practices that they might deduce out of certain sections of scripture around questions about voting and representation. Like the book of Judges becomes important in that regard. Some of the stories of Moses and the people of Israel in the desert become important. Of course, this also creates a shadow side, and that shadow side on the one hand is what we call supersessionism, right? Which is the idea that the church replaces Israel, which means that if you have Jewish people in your midst, then you already think about them as a problem because, right, they've been replaced. So why do they continue to stubbornly exist? So you could see how that would be a problem. The other problem, though, is going to become, once you start talking about the people Israel as sort of your model, well, if you look at the arc of the story, Israel gets led out of bondage through the wilderness and brought into the promised land. And what do they have to do in the promised land? They have to make war on the Canaanites. And so the Puritans are going to logically begin to think about Massachusetts Bay Colony as the promised land. And the people who are there before they get there, they're going to think about as Canaanites with whom they must make war, or at least, do their best either to convert them or to move them out of the way. So this does have then this negative shadow side, which is very, very problematic in the history. However, notwithstanding that, this is how they sought to try and navigate how it was that everyone was required or obligated to follow the laws created by the colony, right? Because to follow the law is not just about being obedient, it's because by coming to Massachusetts Bay, you were entering into a covenantal theological relationship with the colony. Even if you yourself were saying you're not going to be a church member, you still had certain obligations to meet. And interestingly enough, the way that this could be deployed would be to say that that the covenant of works, in a sense, is embedded in the conscience. And so, to be a person of good conscience means that you necessarily would agree, in a sense, with the laws of the colony, because those laws are supposed to be derived from Scripture. And so if you took exception to the laws according to conscience, they would often argue to you that you should be punished or exiled in order to restore you to right conscience, because you had become people of false consciousness or bad consciousness. So the way that this could be utilized sometimes troubling. Let's see, I've got a couple of chat comments here. Well, looks like they're having a conversation of their own. So I'll move on. So the covenant of works then is the common. This is what holds everyone together from the perspective of those essentially who are in charge in New England. The covenant of grace then extends only to effectively the visible saints, the elect, the predestined church members, right? So church members are understood in the sense to function under the covenant of grace. This has to do with the belief that this is right. This is the gift of God. This is the grace that comes to you. You enter into that covenant by the experience of conversion, and you continue in that covenant by being someone who can enthusiastically and with some vigor uphold and freely do the works required, even under the covenant of works. Excuse me. So as it says here, once you've entered into this covenant by conversion, it was thought that you would be able to live more freely into the covenant of works. So the argument, in a sense, that they're trying to make is that to truly come to Jesus, right, or to become a member of the church through conversion and all that kind of stuff, it's not just that it has a benefit that you're going to be able to vote. It's that actually you're going to become an even more sort of upright citizen who cares about the whole covenant community, because you're going to abide by the laws created by the colony. So there's sort of this like sense of benefit that would accrue to you in that regard. Let me stop for a second and see what kinds of comments here. Yeah, so Cheryl asked me, so killing off the Indians came from the Bible and Moses' time. Well, it became one of the tropes. I mean, I think it'd be fair to say it's difficult to say that like there's an idea that we have to kill these people versus we want this land, these people are in our way. Can we come up with a theological rationale or a political rationale to help us get that done? And I tend to think that the thought process probably operates more according to the latter than to the former. In other words, I don't think people are ideologically driven initially to eradicate native peoples. I think rather they want land, and then the idea comes up later, and maybe later on, some people are just driven by hate or they're driven by ideology, but that the initial idea is accumulation of property essentially, and what was at the time sort of the source of wealth in that period of the time was land. That was central. Okay, any other comments or questions before I just outline quickly the theological element here? That's a good question. So the first one, Barbara Holm asks, did the church have to approve new people that wanted to move into the area? I don't know. That's a really great question. I have not run into that, but I have run into in some of the scholarship, there was correspondence that was happening between England and New England. And there was an example of John Cotton carrying on a correspondence with an aristocrat, an English aristocrat, who had Puritan sympathies, but who was basically trying to negotiate the privileges that would come with his position in England, that those would be translated into the New England context. And I'm not exactly sure what those privileges would have been, but I think they had to do with having more of a voice in the life of the church and perhaps in the life of the state. And Cotton, through that correspondence, the Englishman decided not to move to Massachusetts Bay because Cotton was pretty much saying that that's not going to fly here. But I don't know if he said you're not welcome or not. That's just a good question. All right. Any other comments or questions? Let's see one more chat here. Yeah,
Christian, I just have a comment.
go ahead.
All of this that you're talking about and the kinds of penalties they can impose on people and things they can do. I mean, this puts religion kind of at the center of their whole lives. I mean, this is a big deal, not just a little thing they go over to church on Sunday, is it?
That's right. Yeah, the whole of their life is consumed by this question, and that is the case whether you want it to be or not.
If you live in these colonies, you're
Right.
controlled by them.
That's right.
When did the Salem witch hunts happen?
I believe that's 1650s, 1660s. So it's into the next generation, second or third generation. So it's down the road a little bit.
When did the Scarlet Letter happen?
I'm not sure about that. I mean, the thing that's
Well, that was fictional, but
yeah, that book is written in the 19th century and becomes sort of central to how people wind up thinking about the Puritans. And I think there are a lot of Puritan scholars who would say it's somewhat unfair, but
okay.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry, I didn't mean.
That's all right. Thanks, Jeff.
Christian, if I can just add on,
Yeah, go ahead.
that kind of civil law supporting church beliefs has been active and is still active right up till now. The blue laws, when businesses had to be closed on Sundays, and up to the laws on homosexuality and the laws on abortion. That's all because of people trying to have civil government enact laws to enforce church beliefs, and of course conflict over which churches believe what stuff and things like that. So when we start complaining about Sharia law being places, I mean, we've had our own versions of it with varying degrees from the Salem on up until much milder now. So it's not something that's totally in the past.
No, I think that's right. I think this is probably one of the dynamics that makes up part of the American democratic experience of trying to navigate this. And it's just I also say it's part of the human condition, in the sense that human beings tend to have some form of a religious, like they'll call them homo religiosus, which means that human beings are worshiping animals, right? So we have a religious inclination, and religion is part of sort of one of the key, has often been one of the key vehicles by which we've made meaning in our life and tried to understand why we're here and why we know we're here, as opposed to, maybe being an animal, which is not quite as self-reflective. So, and then of course needing to organize ourselves and having all these different opinions about that. But I appreciate those comments, Ross. I just want to this is remarkable. Barbara is sharing that her ancestor Martha Carrier was executed in Salem in August of 1692, and I'm assuming that's because of the witch trials, because that's the same year it looks like it started, according to Bob Keller. Yeah, that's remarkable. Thank you for sharing that. I don't know if you want to say anything about that.
Well, my brother has done the ancestry research, but then once he discovered this, I read up about these trials, and another of her descendants wrote a book about being the daughter of a heretic, which was very interesting because it gave a lot of detail about life in New England at that time. The trial was, reading about the trial, I think she was the only sane person in the room, but yet she was convicted. So
yeah. So, and I was not planning to get into the witch trials, but they, to me, show the same dynamic of what I'm going to describe in just a few minutes with Roger Williams and Anne Hutchinson, which are some of the earliest people who get exiled. But by the time we get into the witch trials, of course, the penalty is obviously much greater. But it's the same basic kind of dynamic. How do we hold together something that really can't be held together, right? And then there probably are some other social psychology elements that seem to be at play. But I really appreciate you sharing that. Let me kind of move us through. And if you have any material on that, please email that to me. I'd be fascinated to read up on some of that. So let me, as I transition us, before we start talking about the people who took exception, let me just quickly lay out the basic assumptions of the sort of theological assumptions in New England. Some of this is going to sound familiar from what we talked about before. So first of all, the New England theology, in a sense, is sort of the Puritan version of Calvinism at this time. Now, it's going to, over time, it will morph and change, and you'll see some of that hopefully later as we move through our time together over the weeks. But the first is this notion of double predestination. We've talked about this before. This is the belief that is articulated by Calvin and then becomes kind of codified in a number of Reformed confessions that from before all time, God has chosen whom God will save and has chosen whom God will damn. So double predestination is God actively choosing to save some and condemn others. There are going to be numerous, by the way, revolts against this vision from within the Calvinist tradition. So people don't just criticize it from without, they criticize it almost most intensely from within. But this is something that most of the early Puritans are going to affirm, right? They're going to affirm that there are some who are chosen and others who are not chosen, and in fact are chosen to be potentially, punished for all eternity. However, this is the wrinkle, this is the distinction of Puritanism over against other forms of Calvinism, and that is a desire to have a sign that tells you whether you are elect or not. So Calvin had argued in the Institutes that you could not know if you were chosen or not chosen, and you can imagine the psychological, drag that would produce, which it did in certain forms of Reformed theology. But the Puritans argued, we can have experiences of God that inform us and tell us that we are among the elect. And of course, you need to have that, especially if you're going to have a vision of the church that they want to have, which is a purified company only of the elect. The first of those signs is the sign of the new birth, right? The experience of conversion. And this experience tended to have a kind of elaborate set of steps, which came to be called the order of salvation. Depending on which scholar you're reading, you would have something like, loathing of your sin, coming to realize that you could do nothing of your own, coming into some sort of a relationship and encounter with God, throwing yourself upon God's mercy, etc. But there would be 5 to 6 steps. And typically this would have to be enunciated. If you were going to go before the church, you would have to be able to tell your story in such a way that it seemed to fit into these prescribed sets of steps. And they change a little bit. And so I myself am not as familiar with the Puritan version, but there is another Methodist version that you can kind of encounter that I've encountered before myself. So new birth then is the first sign that you might be among the elect. But the Puritans also believe that it's possible to have an experience of new birth and potentially to fall away from the faith, right? Because they actually they are kind of realists to a certain extent in that they observe human history, they observe human experience, and they know that there are people who in their midst are strong believers at one point in their life, and later on in their life, they're not a strong believer. So they argue that not only should you have an experience of new birth, but that you should pursue what they call an assured faith. So the doctrine of assurance becomes very important in the Puritan context. You're trying to find assurance that you are truly elect by God, that you are truly embraced, that your conversion experience was not just, an emotional thing. It was actually a real experience, etc. And they begin to argue pretty intensely that the primary way that you find assurance is through the attempt to meticulously fulfill the law of God. And this comes to be called precisionism. So, and it simply is a word made up of precise reading and attempts to work out your salvation in fear and trembling, like giving a certain amount. You have to tithe a certain amount. You have to observe the Sabbath, right? And on the Sabbath, there are very definite things that you should be doing and should not be doing, et cetera. Now, they're not exactly the same thing as prescribed in the Old Testament, but the basic kind of outlines of what they're going to try to do is found there. So double predestination, everything is of grace, is the argument. That's why Calvin argues that you have to have double predestination. He thinks it's a proper interpretation of grace. And then signs of grace, experience of new birth, which has to look a certain kind of way, the pursuit of an assured faith through precise attempts to fulfill God's law, right? That's the basic vision that sort of is operating certainly within the leadership among New England Puritans. And this is what they're going to be articulating in their writings, what they're going to be teaching in school at Harvard College, which was founded in 1636. Okay, I know we're kind of tight on time, but I want to get through I have sort of two people that we want to talk about who within the first decade call into question this vision. And they suffer certain consequences, but they also they show us that even among Congregationalists, not everybody's agreeing, right? And so that's an important thing to note. And I think it's something that we probably already know about Congregationalism simply from our own experience at Colonial. So as I mentioned here from the very beginning, Puritan uniformity is challenged, and it's most often challenged by people on the inside. There certainly are outsiders like the Quakers and others who are going to challenge, but there are particularly strong-voiced insiders who bring a very important resistance element to this. I would argue this is because of the dynamics of two key aspects of Congregationalism that sort of haven't worked themselves out in a sense. They really are some of the most important elements. I think they continue to be important for us. One is the centrality of conscience, right? That no person can be forced to believe something or to not believe something. And that in a sense, the conscience should be a space protected. Now, if your conscience leads you, to outwardly manifest in certain kinds of ways, again, this is where there's gonna be negotiation, trial and error, and an awful lot of bloodshed that's gonna happen. But nevertheless, the centrality of conscience, right? The freedom of conscience. And then the second is what we talked about early on, which is the emphasis on local autonomy, that each local church is in a sense unto itself, because it answers only to the living presence of Christ and to the covenanted members of the community. Well, that means then that potentially you're going to have several different types of congregationalism, because at each different church, you're going to have a different expression in a sense. So the plurality of congregationalisms is important in this. So the first of our two figures is Roger Williams. He's an important figure, certainly in the history of the Baptist Church, as he oftentimes is put forward as one of the earliest Baptist in North America, and one of the earliest Baptists in general. He comes over very, very early on, right? If they're coming over in 1630, he's here in 1631, and he begins with the Plymouth congregation because he has pretty strong separatist convictions. Eventually, though, he will integrate into the Massachusetts Bay Colony and will take up a position as a pastor of the Salem Church in 1633. Well, pretty much from the get-go. So 1633 he gets exiled in 1636. So it takes 3 years basically for Roger to get himself into trouble. And there are several things that he does. So number one, the first thing that he does very early on is that he calls into question whether or not the Massachusetts Bay Colony itself is actually legal. In fact, he argues that the royal charter that had granted them land was in fact a sinful theft. He says the king is a liar because the king has no authority to give land that doesn't belong to him. So he's basically saying all the people in the Massachusetts Bay Colony should repent and find another way to remunerate or work out something with the native people. So Williams has a very strong pro-indigenous peoples aspect to him. There are other parts of him that are going to be more negative in that regard, but at least on this issue. Now, this freaks out everybody in the colonies when they start hearing this, obviously. And it's not just because they have an insider who's saying this, it's because at the very same moment, back in England, Charles I, the monarch, is currently reviewing all royal charters that had been given to the colonies. So they are worried that William's arguments potentially could wind up having reverberations back in England. So the second thing is that he argues that oaths of loyalty to the state are idolatrous. And so a central element of living in Massachusetts Bay Colony, right, was to take an oath of loyalty. So this is where you start to hear more of the Baptist, Anabaptist elements in Williams. And then he argues very strongly for separation of church and state. So he's going to intensely object to the magistrates having any role whatsoever in the life of the church, including calling synods and things of that nature. And then eventually he's going to himself become a Baptist and reject infant baptism, but that's not quite as important at this point. So what happens? By 1635, so over 2 years, local ministers they come together and they try to bring Williams around, and they also appeal to his church. But Williams is a very strong leader, and so he's really able to kind of rally the Salem church. And they effectively argue that local ministers have no authority in the life of this congregation, right? Because at the time, the belief was that a minister had authority only in the congregation to which they were ordained and sent. They couldn't even perform the Eucharist in other places. So he argues that our local church does not need to submit to the things that you're saying, and through local autonomy, he's able to resist them. Eventually, the problems seem to be such a threat, particularly around questions of oaths of loyalty to the state, that the general court steps in and orders, in a sense, Williams to cease preaching these things and to stop teaching them and encouraging the members of his church to follow through on them. And Williams will double down on his position, not only by emphasizing local autonomy, but by actively dissociating the Salem church from the other churches. He basically argues that all the other churches are no longer true churches because they have capitulated to the idolatry of the state. Well, this proves to be too much for the congregation. That they're kind of like, okay, we were with you until you did that, and so they basically step back. And effectively, at that point, Williams has to wind up going into exile. So he is exiled in 1636. He wanders through the wilderness. He had actually learned Algonquin, and he becomes a pretty strong ally of the Narragansett native tribes. And they help him to settle in what eventually comes to be Rhode Island, where he founds Providence Plantations, which is the first of the colonies to offer explicitly liberty of conscience and something like freedom of religion or separation of church and state. So Williams then has set up a series of questions about uniformity. What's the relationship of the state to the church? He's raised other kinds of important ethical questions. The second person is one of the most important women in the early history of North America in terms of kind of modern history, I suppose we could say. And this is Anne Hutchinson, whom you may have heard of before. And by the way, in our church, we have rooms, that represent both the people who were in charge, like John Winthrop, but also people who called into question all that, like the Roger Williams room and the Anne Hutchinson room. So we sort of have this whole panoply at play in some of the rooms named in our church. So Anne Hutchinson winds up getting involved in what comes to be called the antinomian controversy. Antinomian simply means anti-law. All right, so let me kind of spell this out quickly, and I know we're a little bit over time, so if you need to hop off, that's perfectly fine. This will continue to be recorded on YouTube. So first of all, we can say a couple things about Anne. She's a very effective speaker, very, very good thinker. She is over in England. She's a member of John Cotton's church. And John Cotton, if you recall, is one of the earliest and most important Puritans to wind up migrating to Massachusetts Bay. She and her family, I think she has like 11 kids or something. They wind up migrating from England and arrive in 1634. So again, within about 4 years of the founding of the colony. She's also a very skilled midwife, and this is kind of the place in a sense where she probably is making a living. And she begins, because of her leadership skills and her, active mind, and her ability to really speak and kind of express herself well. She starts holding sessions for women in town in Boston to discuss sermons and to offer some commentary on the sermons. And of course, this probably starts out, relatively benign, but because of the acuity, and the insights that she offers, this group winds up growing to up to 82 people. So at the height of it, 82 people is a lot of people to come, first of all, to a house meeting and not to be noticed by the authorities. And of course, it's a mixed group. That's the other key thing. It's both men and women. And so here, and the gender politics here are on the surface. Here is a woman teaching, right? In a time when women aren't even allowed to vote. Right, so you can imagine how the authorities are kind of thinking about this. All right, so she gets involved within 2 years of her being there. Her brother-in-law also arrives during this time, and he actually is a preacher. So he and John Cotton are two different ministers at two different churches, and so these become the people sort of that she sees herself as being connected to. So eventually, because of these things that are going on, and the content of her criticism, it launches this thing called what comes to be called the antinomian controversy, which lasts for about 2 years and ends with Anne Hutchinson being exiled. So first of all, just to kind of talk in an evolutionary quick fashion, antinomianism, this whole thing kind of starts because Anne Hutchinson basically argues that only John Cotton and her brother-in-law are the ones who are truly preaching the gospel in the colony. So you can imagine that other ministers are going to find this offensive. And to be fair, John Cotton was already having arguments with the other ministers. So there is some basis for this, even in John Cotton's own writings and arguments at the time. Her basic argument is that she basically calls into question a lot of that New England theology we talked about. So she starts from the premise that the gospel is supposed to be about grace. But whenever I go to church, what I always hear about is works. And she's basically saying this excessive emphasis on works as a sign of grace basically makes it sound like my salvation is really wrapped up in what I do rather than what God has done. And so her way of navigating this is to argue that God does indeed elect us, but that we know that we're elect not because of what we do, but because of the inner witness of the Spirit. And so that's kind of the place where she makes that differentiation. So as you can see there, she's still concerned about assurance. She still would emphasize new birth, but it's the precisionism element that she rejects. And she says assurance of salvation doesn't come through outward manifestations. It comes rather through an inward witness of the Spirit. And at the same time, the other element we want to kind of weave in here is the political component, which is this is the beginning of the Pequot War, which we won't be able to talk about today, but I'll come back to next week. And this is the first and probably the most consequential of the early conflicts between the colonists and the native peoples. Well, she is actually encouraging some of her followers not to participate in this war because they have objections to a specific army chaplain at the time. So they're not necessarily saying that they wouldn't fight, but at the time they're taking exception to a key figure in the army, and it's having the same kind of effect. So they're not supporting, in other words, the political aims at the time of the colony. So what do we have at play here? When the trial happens, we have gender, right? Anne Hutchinson, a woman, strong, thoughtful, and actually has a career that in some ways is like not the domain of men. She's a midwife, right? So that's scary. Number two, the political element, right? Causing trouble, not only in terms of calling into question the basic social order about men and women, but even around this question of participating in the Pequot War. And then number three, the theological argument. So all three of these things, I think it'd be fair to say, are at play in the trial the trial and her eventual exile. So during her trial, what we know is that she basically is brought before several ministers, and she pretty much for like 2 or 3 days can parry everything that they're talking about. So that like she shows herself to be quite learned theologically speaking, and she's able to navigate and negotiate and offer answers to every question that's put to her. It's not until she says that she has received a direct revelation from God that tells her that she's saved, right? The inner witness of the Spirit. That's when they declare her a heretic, because they basically argue no one can receive direct revelations from God because that leads to fanaticism. And so that's their expectation. And I think it'd be fair to say they were looking for something, right? They are looking for some way to silence this woman, and they kind of latch onto this, and that is exactly what they do. She is exiled in 1638. She actually goes, spends some time with Roger Williams, eventually will leave and winds up in Long Island, and actually she will die in a confrontation between colonists and native peoples on Long Island. And many of her followers are also exiled. Probably one of the most important is a woman named Mary Dyer, who becomes a Quaker and who is going to come back to the colonies, attempting to sort of spread her Quaker vision, and she will be executed by the colonists later on. We won't necessarily follow that story, but that's a component of this. So what do we get here, right? It's not the picture we get here is not necessarily like a direct set of things. It really is, though, I think, an attempt to create a sort of hermetically sealed vision of church and state with a highly prescribed theology and an expectation of uniformity. In other words, what we get in New England is the attempt to basically do what the king and other people were doing in England, except now we're going to do it based on congregational principles. At the same time, though, we also find the very same dynamic, right? In England, the king is trying to enforce uniformity to the vision of the Anglican Church, and what happens? It meets with resistance. So the same thing happens here in New England. We have resistance from the very beginning, right? Within 2 to 3 years of having established a colony. And think about that, 2 to 3 years. When you spend most of your time drawing water and hewing wood and plowing fields, that's not a lot of time for people to make mischief necessarily, right? So the vision, in other words, that's being established initially has cracks in it pretty much early on. And I think what we're going to see as we move through our time together are an attempt to continue and to hold on to some essential elements of congregationalism, but also the need to figure out what does that mean, right? What is it going to mean for us to be congregationalist if we can't, make the entire society conform to our vision? All right, I've just unshared screens to open up for folks if they have comments or questions or. Any other comments or questions? I just got a thumbs up from Chris. Thank you. There's another from Bruce. All right. Well, I'm shocked. Oh, good. Oh, good. Okay. Thank you, Jeff. I
Oh, I
need,
just want to say, good to see Bruce back.
yes,
He's been
absolutely.
out for a little while. He's looking pretty smiley there, Bruce. Maybe we should all go through what you've gone through. It looks like it's been good for you.
I'm not sure that's the right approach, but thank you for your comments anyway.
All right. Well, I think, first of all, thank you all for your patience, for being here and kind of working through this with me. Next week, we will turn to talk a little bit about the early colonists' engagement with Native peoples. And then we will talk a little bit about some things that happen over in England. And then we will fast forward through the next few generations to get us up closer into the 18th century and the Great Awakening. So we're going to push our story forward a little bit. Let me just close this with a brief word of prayer, and I look forward to seeing all of you next week. Lord, we thank you for this day, and we thank you for the ability to reflect upon and try to understand those who've come before us. Help us as we make our assessments to be as generous as we can, but also to see the places where lamentation and grief really have to be a part of our assessment. Thank you that you put all of us in different times and places, and you don't put us there alone. You put us there with one another and with your word and your spirit, and you call on us to do the best that we can to be faithful. And that is our longing and desire, Lord, is to be faithful to you. We ask and pray that you empower us now and send us forth in your spirit. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. Great to see you, Bruce.
Thank you, Christian.
Thank you.